The slave trade from Africa to Arab countries continued right until the beginning of the 20th century. For instance, slavery in Saudi Arabia was formally abolished as late as 1962.
What? Alright, slavery in the early Caliphate. Holy hell. Like, the last reaction that I did to slavery on the largest slave revolt in the Caliphate, the amount of people, like I predicted, that were coping in the comments was extraordinary. Like, it was absurd. It was honestly just absurd and just flat out ridiculous. But I'm going to be talking more about that later because I'm going to respond to it, but
just like in the rest of the ancient world,
there is nothing to respond to. I mean, all my statement still stands.
Slavery was a common practice in Arabia centuries before the coming of Islam. Sources tell about slaves being brought to Arabia from the Middle East, India, and other countries. But the biggest source of slaves in pre-Islamic Arabia were African slaves from present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Mozambique, Kenya, and so on. Old Arabic poetry tells about dark-skinned foreign slaves called Habash. Slavery persisted after Islam became the law of the land in Arabia.
Again, like, bro, people were saying that, oh, this is one of the copes that, oh, slavery, like, the Arabs weren't racist. Bro. Like, it's clear that they clearly favored lighter skin tone people. Like, that's clear as day. I mean, even in the previous video that I reacted to about this, it literally talked about a guy who was trying to defend the fact that the Arabs clearly had racist tendencies by literally using God's name in vain. Right? If you remember me talking about that, and people were literally in my comments, like Arabs and Muslims were like, "Oh no, that's not true. It didn't matter what skin color you, bro. Like it's clear. It's like saying the sky is red. Like, bro."
And
I'm not arguing about that.
Territorial advance of the Caliphate as well. How did slavery in Arabia transform following the ascent of Islam? What kind of work were the slaves forced to do in the territory of the Caliphate? In this episode, Kings and Generals is going to talk about slavery in the Caliphate. Medieval soldiers were enticed with
sponsor. And here's another thing, quick announcement, guys. If I am slow at responding to your comments, by the way, that is because, I'm like doing things in like my other, like, in person, right? Like, I work 2 jobs and whatnot, and I'm gonna be starting college soon, so I will be slower at responding than usual. This is why I said that you should maybe consider becoming a channel member for 99 cents a month if you want to, because as I get more people and I do more things in my personal life, right, my priorities are going to be shifting. But if you're a channel member, I'll still give you my priority, right? So I'm just,
or via our link in the description,
just throwing that out there for you to hear. All right.
Slavery in Arabia goes back to the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, ignorance period. Arabia had several sources of slave supply, and the largest among them were conflicts. Arabs would raid bordering Byzantine and Persian provinces for the purposes of getting war booty and slaves, and the Ajami, Iraqi slaves, were prominent among them. Intertribal conflict within Arabia would result in the victorious side taking the surviving members of the losing tribe as prisoners, but most of them were ransomed before they could be turned into slaves. But the majority of slaves...
So it's basically the same thing like how West African kingdoms would... This is exactly how it was. West African kingdoms would war each other, fight each other, and whoever lost, they just took the slaves, and then when the Europeans came, they simply sold off those slaves to the Europeans.
Were imported from Africa. Mecca was a major trading center of the region at the time, and trade caravans, including those which transported African slaves, were going through Mecca. Arab slave owners would purchase them in Mecca. Also, raiding parties would attack caravans and capture slaves for themselves or sell them later. There were 2 types of slaves, purchased ones and slaves born in the house of their master. Arabia's climate and terrain limited the scope of work in which slaves could be used, but they would work as servants of rich Arabs, as shepherds, and as caravan guides. Female slaves would also be used for sexual purposes.
Alright, so I mean, that sentiment still lives on, keeping it real here. Don't get me wrong, I know the Europeans did the same thing, but you know, one of the main copes that I saw in the last video that I reacted to on this, I had people trying to tell me that slavery in the Arab world / Islamic world was better than European slavery, when what I was saying was they were both equally bad. And they are. Like this one guy I was discussing this with. He said, so slavery is better. I said no, they were basically equally just as bad. Like, objectively speaking, they were equally just as bad. And then whenever I would point out some details why in instances where slavery in the Islamic world would actually be much worse than European slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, he would say, like, he would show me instances where Europeans would do the same thing, and I'm like, thank you for proving my point. They're just as equal. Like, the fact that people were even trying to argue this is absurd. And if you're actually trying to argue this, go get your brain checked. Like, really, like you physically cannot argue this, dude. Like, you can't. It's like saying that freaking a human isn't naturally born with legs. Like, you can't argue that no matter how you try. And the thing is everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but opinions can be wrong. If I look and I say the sky is blue, well, no, not sky is blue, but the sky is red, I'm entitled to have that opinion, but everybody's gonna look at me and be like, nigga, you dumb. Because the sky is clearly blue. Same logic here. If you're trying to argue this, I don't care about your opinion, but it is clearer than the clouds in the sky that they were both equally bad. And you want, and it's funny because they like the Muslims and the Arabs, right? They just couldn't admit. It was actually funny to watch. It actually made me laugh. I'm not even gonna lie to you. They just could not admit that they were no better than Europeans. Like, it was actually hilarious. It was like, I was reading the comments. I'm just like, why can't you just admit that you are no better than Europeans? Like, but you want to know why? I know why. I know why. Because they love to bash Europeans for any and everything. So now, when they realize, oh, we're no better than them, that's problematic, right? And this is not me defending Europeans. Oh, no. But I'm just saying, I don't like how, like, this vendetta, I don't know, like, vendetta, that's the word, I guess, to use, that a lot of these people, these Muslims and Arabs have with, like, European or anything, like, Eurocentric or whatever, like, I talked about that in my video where it's like, oh, yeah, they just crying and complaining because their countries were colonized, like, boohoo, boohoo, Crimea River, boohoo, boohoo, womp, womp, right? Like, dude, get over yourself. Like, your country, that's the thing, bro. It's like, bro, your country isn't even colonized anymore, and yet your country still has so much internal problems that other Muslims and other Arabs are causing. So that says a lot in on itself. Let's continue.
In theory, Islam saw a natural state of a human being as being free, stated as al-asa huwa il-hurriya. Islam brought some limitations and regulations to slavery in Arabia, but slavery was such an ordinary phenomenon for that age along with being a fundamental element of Arab society, that it was not possible to outright prohibit slavery. All of the
That is crazy. I had people who used to tell me that way before, like, oh, Islam bans slavery, slavery is allowed, or this type of slavery isn't allowed. Bro. Now, here's the thing. The slavery in the Bible times, right, was different. Slavery in the Bible times were like, when the Bible talks about, when I say Bible times, I'm just talking like, in like, you know what I'm talking about when I say Bible times, right? When the scriptures were, now being written. Slavery then was different. That was a different form of slavery. That was more like servitude, right? But it was still slavery, but it was not like this type of slavery right here, right? So when the Bible talks about slavery, it's more referring to that type of slavery. Now, I could play devil's advocate and say that the Quran means the same thing too, right? And I will play devil's advocate and just say that. However, the slavery that would eventually come to Arabia, even after Islam came to Arabia, yeah, that clearly was like the slavery that was talked about in the last video in the Zanj rebellion. Yeah, that was clearly prohibited in both Islam and Christianity. That was clearly prohibited. Like, that was like, no. That's big no, right? Big no. That's funny because, Europeans engaged in slavery too, but in England banned slavery in Britannia in like the 12th century. Yeah, 12th century. So there was already a thing of, yes, this thing of only other people is bad. That that was around for a while. I don't know if I don't even think any Islam country ever like banned slavery. Did they? When was the earliest time a country or Arab nation or a Middle Eastern country or whatever like banned slavery? When was the earliest time for that? Because a lot of people were telling me that slavery persisted in that region up until the freaking 19th century, until Britain had to stop that, which is ironic as hell. And also the whole thing with the paid workers to, bang bang. I'm not gonna say sex. That's a sentiment that still lives on, especially in the Arab world today. Like, I had people in my comments talking about your ancestors got raped by Europeans. Like, bro, you want to know who were the main ones doing the raping, bro? The Arabs, bro. The Arab Muslims, bro. They were the main ones doing that. Oh yeah, definitely. Some Europeans raped some African slaves, but bro, I would bet all my money that there were probably more slaves that were raped by Arab Muslims than by Europeans to African slaves. All my money, bro. Because that sentiment very much still lives on over there. You could quote me on that. You can very much quote me on that, bro. Especially in places like Dubai and all that. Oh my, bro. Don't let me get started on doo-doo pie, bro. If you know, you know.
Arab elite, including the Prophet, owned slaves. But at the same time, there are numerous Quranic verses and hadiths describing the emancipation of slaves by the Prophet Muhammad, such as Bilal, who became the first muezzin, caller for prayer in the history of Islam, and Zayd.
So what the hell? Wait. So the Quran is being inconsistent here. Come on, like, what is it? Is it banned or is it not banned? Like, in the Christian Bible, the Old Testament was permitted, but the type of slavery that it was talking about wasn't like, I'm gonna go whip you and beat you to death, and not brutal slavery. We're gonna call it that, right? It was just more of you're just a servant, pretty much, right? And also, you need to remember when the Bible was written. A lot of translations and the things that it described were kind of different, and the way it was translated might not exactly match what it really meant. So do keep that in mind, because I realize that a lot of people tend to misunderstand that about the Bible. So when it was talking about slavery, it's more talking about being a servant. But anyways, that was the Old Testament. The New Testament is where it just flatly just outlines that, yeah, no, like slavery, like everyone is equal under God, right? That's how God created us to be. The New Testament clearly outlines that God created all of us to be equal, and thus slavery, no, big no. So yeah, just responding to that, because some people were like, "What? Didn't Christianity like also allow slavery too, brah?"
Muhammad's stepson. During his farewell sermon, Muhammad said, "An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action."
Hilarious. Okay, so again, like I have so many people telling me that, oh, Islam banned slavery, and it's funny because not a single soul ever brought up the fact that Islam allowed slavery up until that video. This is why I said people were coping so hard it was funny, and I was like, bro, are you like for real? Like nobody ever mentioned the fact that Islam allows slavery up until that point, and now people were like, oh yeah, well yeah, Islam allows slavery, you know, that's just how things were. That was another cope that people had. Oh, that's just how things were, so it's whatever's. If that's how things were, why do you always love to bash Europeans for something that happened literally 200 years ago? That's just how things were back then. Right? It's funny. The double standards, bro. It's literally like the double standard of, oh, it's only okay when I do it.
Historians
Absolutely ridiculous.
argue that prohibiting slavery in the context of 7th century Arabia apparently would have been as useful as prohibiting poverty. It would have reflected a noble ideal, but would have been unworkable on an immediate basis without establishing an entirely new socio-economic system. And its recommendation that slaves be freed is on the same plane as its recommendation that the poor be clothed and the hungry be fed. Thus, slavery...
So slavery was a fundamental part of Arabia, the Arab world, the Muslim world. I mean, really? And then these are the same people who spam my comments trying to bring up slavery that happened in Barbados, bro. Oh,
was
okay.
not prohibited in Islam.
I swear I'm gonna take 2 of those videos that I have on slavery here and just put it on my channel front page for any newcomers, just so that that's the first thing that they see. I'm gonna do that. I said that I was gonna do that in my last reaction. I'm still gonna do that.
But the ascension of the Islamic Caliphate led to some reforms in terms of treatment of slaves, their release, and amended procedures related to enslavement. The Quran stated that a slave Muslim is better than a free pagan, that it was better to marry a slave Muslim female than a free pagan. Islam barred Muslims from enslaving other Muslims, called for humane and kind treatment of slaves, and prohibited killing them. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim freed 8,000 of his slaves on his deathbed as manumission was encouraged by Islam. A child born to a freeman father and a slave mother was considered free. This slave woman could not be sold off anymore and would be set free upon the death of the master. The state prohibited freemen from selling their children into slavery as a punishment for debt or a crime. Despite this, the slave
Yeah, but that's great. I mean, it's great. I respect the Quran for clearly outlining this. Here's the thing, right? Anything that I say, I'm not bashing the Quran for it. I don't bash the Quran. I'm bashing the people who aren't following what it clearly says, who claim to be Muslim, but you're clearly not following the rules of it. So good on the Quran for outlining that, right? But how did people actually follow it? Like, did they actually follow it? Is the real question. Let's see.
Population increased due to purchase through military campaigns, commercial purchase, procreation of slaves, and interstate agreements, where the Caliphate insisted on payment of tribute through the import of slaves. People of the book, Jews and Christians, were safe from being enslaved, but Muslims could purchase Jewish and Christian slaves, in case they had become slaves before their purchase, but it was allowed to turn pagans into slaves, even if they would decide to convert to Islam. Moreover, there was a distinction in terms of enslavement between Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. Dar al-Islam was the territory where Islam was prevalent, and therefore the laws of peacetime applied, while Dar al-Harb was the territory dominated by non-believers who did not recognize Allah and Muhammad as his prophet. Therefore, a peacetime law did not apply there. This loophole was used to import slaves who were already Muslims, or for the castration of slaves, a practice which was prohibited by Islam. Although good
And I had people, bro, I had someone trying to freaking justify castration. Oh my god, bro. That one made me laugh. That one made me freaking laugh. Like, bro. Why can't you just sit down and just say, yeah, this was bad and we did it? The fact that bro went in my comments trying to type a justification it's so freaking sad. It's hilariously sad. And kind of just pathetic, to be honest. Like, there's no other way to put it.
Treatment of slaves was encouraged by Islam. Slaves were essentially rightless. Their testimonies were not admitted at judicial proceedings.
Wait, let me hear this. Hold on a second. I gotta hear that. Hold on a second.
Which was prohibited by Islam. Although good treatment of slaves was encouraged by Islam, slaves were essentially rightless. Their testimonies were not admitted at judicial proceedings. Offence against slaves required half of the punishment envisaged for the same offence against freemen. Slaves were not allowed to enter into a contract, and so on. The death rate of slaves was quite high, particularly among those employed for plantation and mining slavery.
It's the same thing. This is literally the same thing as European slavery that happened in the transatlantic slave trade. That's it. This is the same thing. Oh, but the Quran, bro. The Quran, bro. The Quran. Good on the Quran, but in practice, this is literally the same exact thing as European slave, bruh.
On the other hand, the vast majority of slaves lived under better conditions than, for instance, their counterparts in ancient Greece and Rome. Masters were obliged to provide slaves with medical attention, shelter, and support in old age, and were prohibited from overworking them. They could be forced by Islamic courts to emancipate a slave whom they had mistreated. In some cases, slaves had a contractual right to buy their freedom over time, or be emancipated upon the master's death. The expansion of the Caliphate.
Okay, finally something that seems a bit better. Hold on, I'm gonna replay that again. Make sure that I heard these details properly before I speak.
Slavery. On the other hand, the vast majority of slaves lived under better conditions than, for instance, their counterparts in ancient Greece and Rome. Masters were obliged to provide slaves with medical attention, shelter, and support in old age, and were prohibited from overworking them. They could be forced by Islamic courts to emancipate a slave whom they had mistreated. In some cases, slaves had a contractual right to buy their freedom over time, or be emancipated upon the master's death.
Okay, that's a bit that's a bit different, right? The only similarity I see here is that Europeans had to feed their slaves too and give them shelter. But the other stuff, there was an instance where I actually talked about this, not even in my Islam reaction, but my American Revolution reaction. But in the year 1790, not exactly 1790, I think it was 1793 or 91, 1793, 91. But in the 1790s, Britain passed a law, the Lesser Antilles Act or something like that. You can go Google it to read about it if you want. The Lesser Antilles Act, just Google it. You'll see the law that I'm talking about. Basically, this law just it was supposed to make the lives of slaves in the Lesser Antilles Caribbean better. Like masters could have been punished for mistreating them. They had to be treated adequately. Basically, kind of the same thing here that he said, except for the whole being free when the master died. Except for that part. But they had to be, yeah. Everything else kind of applied the same thing too. But in practice, even though the law was passed, in practice, you know, it's like it couldn't really be enforced, right? It wasn't really enforced. It couldn't really be enforced. It was quite impossible to do that, right? So again, that's another case of that's great that it passed. I mean, it's a big deal. It is a big deal, especially in the 1790s, for a law like that to pass. That's a big deal. But people aren't really adhering to that law, right? So, you know, it's great that England passed that law, right? But the people who were supposed to follow it weren't, you know, following it. It wasn't really being enforced, right? But it was still a good thing that it passed, just like in the Quran. Like, you know, what the Quran said about slavery, like, yeah, it's a good thing that's there so that, you know, you clearly have something to outline that, hey, this is clearly bad. But, you know, most of the people still aren't doing it, right? So, again, I will give a point. I'll give this to the Arab Muslims, but I could technically, because the law didn't apply to my country, because my country isn't a part of the Lesser Antilles. It was just specifically for the Lesser Antilles, right? Not anywhere else. Not for their bigger Antilles islands like Jamaica, which slavery was horrible there. Jamaica, Bahamas, you know, nowhere else. Just the Lesser Antilles, British Caribbean, which didn't even include Barbados. But I could technically include that there. But I'll give this to the Muslims. But I'm just saying that so that you have that at the back of your head, because I don't want people spamming my comments like, see, clearly we're morally righteous and superior. Clearly, like, okay, like there's still that too, right? Like I could still argue that it's equal, but just for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I'm just gonna give this to the Arab Muslims. But he doesn't really talk about. I mean, he's just explaining the law, but he's not really talking about how was it in practice, which is what I'm still waiting on. So,
expansion of the Caliphate and its military successes.
Oh yeah, and slaves had to be properly clothed was another thing about the Lesser Antilles law. Honestly, I recommend you just go read it yourself. It's not long. It's really not long. Just Google Lesser Antilles slave law in the British Caribbean, and yeah, just read it there. Or I think yeah. Lesser Antilles slave law 1790s in the British Caribbean, and just say what did it do, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Were the primary sources of slave supply. People of different races and beliefs, such as Assyrians, Copts, Persians, Nubians, Berbers, Indians, Greeks, Turks, Slavs, etc., were enslaved by the Caliphate. slaves were acquired from all over the Middle East, Egypt, Iran, the Caucasus, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, India, Spain, Central and Eastern Europe, even China and Southeast Asia.
Wild.
A significant part of the slave supply of Arabia, even before Islam, was from Africa, with countries like Ethiopia and Nubia being the most prominent in this regard. This continued after the ascension of Islam too, and historian Yosef ben Yochanan argues that jihads were brought to Africa as early as the year 640 AD. The expansion of the Caliphate into Egypt and Sub-Saharan Africa, into what the Arabs called Balad ul-Sudan, the land of the blacks, enabled a higher supply of African slaves into the empire. This supply was both from military conquest and booty, along with treaties signed with African states where they agreed to supply the Caliphate with slaves annually. Moreover, Arabs set up slave trading posts along the southeastern coast of the Indian Ocean, including the archipelago of Zanzibar. This paved the way for the major African slave trade to the Caliphate. Black African slaves were sold in slave markets in Egypt, South Arabia, and the Maghreb. Historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that close to 10 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia and the Caliphate. According to him, every year 5,000 Africans were brought to Arabia as slaves between the years 650 and 1600. Luis Felipe Jalincastro argues that 8 million African people were sold or sent into slavery through the Oriental and Trans-Saharan slavery routes between the 8th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, okay, this is something that I need to bring up too. This was another cope that people were bringing up. Like, people were saying, but the casualty rate, the casualty rate. The European Atlantic slave trade had much more casualties in a short period of time. Yeah. Because when you're traveling over ship, it's more dangerous than when you're traveling over land. And the technology was different. It's just that simple. Traveling over ship is more dangerous than simply just walking over land. Like, come on. Even in regular ships, dude, of like warships, for example, like they would be suffering too from stuff like scurvy. That was a big problem on any ship, really and truly. So, that didn't really surprise me that, the transatlantic slave trade, which was going through like these big wide ocean, would have such a high death rate and high short span of time, right? And then there's also the fact of how, like, what were the slaves being used for, right? Kings and generals pointed out that the Arabian climate kind of limited the usage of slavery. Yeah, that was different in the Caribbean, right? Like, you didn't have that climate problem. Actually, the whole reason why the British anyways went and got black slaves was because they were perfect for the climate. So yeah, it's just circumstances, but it's the same thing. It's just different circumstances led to different results, kind of. So that's how you get that whole idea of, you get that whole thing of, the European transatlantic slave trade had higher deaths in a shorter period of time. Like, yeah, literally different circumstances, duh. Like, oh my gosh, dude. This should be like basic common sense, but it would not be cope if it wasn't basic common sense. Okay, let's continue.
Historians might disagree on the numbers, going as high as 30 million. But the truth is that millions of Africans were forced to live and work as slaves in the Caliphate. The slave trade from Africa to Arab countries continued right until the beginning of the 20th century. For instance, slavery in Saudi Arabia was formally abolished as late as 1962 in Oman.
What? Well, that answers my question earlier in the video when I asked if any country in the Arab world even bothered to abolish slavery if they did win.
Oman in 1970. Africa had become a
19, bro. No freaking way. I give a point to Europeans here because Europeans abolished slavery like so much earlier than that. Now, look, I'm gonna play devil's advocate again, and I will say that the Europeans would eventually find labor elsewhere, anyways. There's also that, but really, really and truly, even now today, we're like in a period of modern slavery where it's like you're getting paid, but you're not getting paid enough, right? If you live in like these countries like America or just the West in general, it's like you're getting scammed, right? You're like overworking yourself and all that.
Pragmatic choice for slave supply of the Caliphate, as towards the 8th century, most...
But still, for you to wait that 1970, bro, what the hell? Bro, my mom was born in 1966, man.
of the borders of the Arab Caliphate had already become more or less stable. There were fewer expansionist wars, which meant there were fewer slaves imported. By then, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Frankish kingdom bordering the Iberian possessions of the Caliphate had become strong enough to oppose further expansion of the Caliphate. Moreover, they were people of the book, and enslavement of Christians was a legally problematic matter. For instance, in the 9th century, the Egyptian Christians rebelled against the Caliphate, and following their defeat, many of them were sold as slaves in Damascus. According to the historian Adam Metz, this was widely criticized in the Caliphate and was considered absolutely illegal. In contrast, sub-Saharan Africa did not have a political entity strong enough to oppose the Caliphate, and it had maintained and enhanced its position as one of the major sources of slave supply for the Caliphate. Unlike the slaves in the Americas, where they were mostly forced to work in manual labor jobs, such as working on plantations and mining, in the Caliphate, slaves were used in a wider scope of jobs. In the Americas, slaves were a major tool of production, while in the Caliphate they were mostly used in service jobs or for military purposes.
It was the same thing too in America. It's just that primarily speaking, they were used for labor jobs, manual labor jobs. No, I even talked about this, how like the British West Indian Regiment, not to be confused with the one that served in World War One, but the British West Indian Regiment, that was slave soldiers. Like Britain literally went, bought slaves and turned them into soldiers in the British Army. And they were legally slaves. And they were privileged. They were very privileged. They were paid. They were basically just a regular soldier, but they were legally slaves. And I even talked about this. This is like a huge ironic thing about the British West Indian Regiment. They bought it from Africa, but that slave regiment would eventually help Britain to conquer and colonize some parts of Africa while legally being slaves. So not just that, but there were other types of jobs that slaves did. Like some slaves were skilled workers too. Did a whole bunch. They were like carpenters, shipwrights. There were also that type of stuff too in the New World. And depending on who you're asking, but you could also be a SCX slave, right? Where you're just banging other slaves to make more slaves, right? This is something that some slave masters would do. They would take like the strongest slaves, right? And they would selectively breed them, right? So the strongest slave would be like the guy who's, banging everybody else. And he would use him because he's the strongest, to pass on his genes to selectively breed, right? So that he could get like more strong slaves, so that he could birth more strong slaves. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. I know the most famous example of that was in Brazil, where that guy lived like that. One slave who lived to 120 years old or something like that. Was wild, right? And he was privileged, yeah, but there's also that type of SC slavery too. I'm just saying, like, there's a whole type of jobs in the New World, and America's like, it wasn't just labor. A lot, like, I always tell people, like, that's kind of a misconception. Like, people think that slavery was just like, you're in the fields and like you're getting whipped and whatnot. That's not true. And also, there was like house slaves. There was also house. Everyone knows what house slaves are, but typically, house slaves were slaves that were lighter in skin tone. If you were like me, right? Like, I had a friend made this joke because I had another friend who was like arguing that he was more light than me, and he was clearly dark skinned as hell. And I went to one of my friends. I was like, okay, who's more light, me or him? And he looked at our pictures, and he looked at him, and he's like, plantation work. And then he looked at my picture, and he was like, housework. That was funny as hell. But I mean, yeah, but you know, that was reserved for more light skinned, light tone people. So I mean, still, but they were still slaves too, even if they were light skinned. So
slaves worked as servants, nurses, concubines, entertainers, eunuchs, business assistants, craftsmen, builders, and soldiers. There were also types of slave jobs,
literally the same thing,
which
like
existed in the Jahiliyyah period, but were prohibited by Islam, such as masters forcing female slaves into prostitution for their personal material gain. Some of the jobs, particularly being a soldier or taking part in administration and
wait. So Islam bans that, but Islam just can't ban like raping slaves? What?
Business allowed for upward social mobility for slaves, and Mamluk slaves are the perfect example of the former. In general, slaves working in domestic and urban settings were not subject to overworking and cruelty, and the problem with the Arab historiography of that period is that it's very much focused on urban Arabia, not only with regard to the issue of slavery, but in general. Slaves working in rural settings are largely overlooked, despite being subject to the hardest living conditions among the slaves of Arabia. They were mostly employed in agriculture, mining, and the drainage of marshes. These were mostly black slaves, who were more prone to being overworked, being subject to cruelty, and living in worse conditions, often crammed in dozens in small spaces. It is said that no slave lived for longer than 5 years in the Saharan salt mines.
That's insane.
Extremely hard.
That's insane. And the fact that they were primarily black too, again, bro, that's just racism right there.
Living and working conditions existed in cotton and sugar fields. The slave labor of the black slaves, Zanj as the Arabs called them, in the marshlands and salt flats of southern Iraq, are among the most vivid examples of cruelty against slaves in the Caliphate. But white slaves were brought to the Caliphate as well, and were mostly employed in the military, as business associates, and for entertainment of the Arab elite. This,
bro, if that isn't racism, I don't know what is.
Demonstrated the existence of racial discrimination in the Caliphate, despite the fact that Islam considered all human beings equal regardless of the color of their skin.
Yeah, and I had people in my freaking last video trying to argue that there was no racism when it came to slavery in the Caliphate. Like, what? Like I had a dude comment like, oh, white slaves were more expensive because they were often captured in wars. Okay, now explain the whole racism between black and white. Clear racist discrimination, like, bro.
Most of the white slaves were Slavic and Turkic. Slavs were considered more expensive than Turks, and were brought into the Caliphate through Germany to Spain. Prague was also one of the centers of the slave trade from Europe to the Caliphate. Meanwhile, Turkic slaves were mostly sold in the slave market of Samarkand. A good-looking white slave woman would cost 1,000 dinars. In some cases, this cost would go as high as 10,000 dinars.
What the hell, bro? What the... Bruh. Did Europeans ever did this to other Europeans, bro? Like, what in the world? I can't think of an instance where there was like this. Even to like Europeans doing it to other Europeans. I mean, I know some Europeans raped some Africans, but this, I don't think there was something like this. I mean, yeah, in some instances, but not as widespread as this. Like, what the hell?
A good-looking black slave woman would cost 150 to 300 dinars. Black male slaves would cost even less. Their purchase was around 25 to 30 dinars. A special category of slaves in the Caliphate were those specialized in arts and entertainment, who were educated by their masters and then sold to the Arab elite for massive sums. 1 to 2,000 dinars was the average cost of an entertainer. In 937, the de facto ruler of the Caliphate, Ibn Raik, purchased a popular female singer for 14,000 dinars. While Islam alleviated the suffering of slaves and placed certain restrictions on their abuse and encouraged good treatment of slaves, their lives were extremely hard.
You hear that? Encourage. Keyword is encourage. Encouraged.
Slaves working in agriculture, mining and construction had a shorter lifespan and were more susceptible to ill treatment. One of the sites of cruel and inhumane treatment of slaves was the Basra marshlands in southern Iraq, where black slaves were forced to work under horrible conditions. They rebelled against the Caliphate in 869 and would trouble the state for more than 2 decades. In our upcoming episode, we're going to talk about the Zanj Rebellion, so make sure you are subscribed.
I already reacted to the Zanj Rebellion, which is why I'm reacting to this video. Anyways, if you're new to my channel, you like what I have to say, make sure you go subscribe. If you have any suggestions for me, comment down below. Go check out my other reactions on the channel. Make sure to like the video too. Helps my stuff stay on the algorithm, man. Thank you for watching and goodbye.